Hello there guys, what is going on? Son of Chelsea back here again for another edition of Let's Talk Chelsea. Hope you've had a good week going into the weekend now where Chelsea will be travelling to the US and we could have finally some official announcements over potential signings. In today's video, Nathan Ake agreeing personal terms with Chelsea, and a bit like Raheem Sterling, it's now just about Chelsea and Man City coming to an agreement over the eventual fee. I'll give you my thoughts again on that deal and what it could mean for Chelsea squad next season. Also, Frenkie De Jong, more about him and kind of that meeting between Todd Boehly and Barcelona last night in terms of what it meant, you know, in terms of the future and some of the players Chelsea could be selling to Barcelona and potentially bidding for in the coming weeks, and also the pre-season tour and Armando Broja potentially leaving, Ian Maatsen not being involved with the squad that is travelling to America and what that all means. But before we get into all that good stuff, hit that like button because it helps new people find the channel, and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of the uploads on the channel over pre-season. But let's get into Nathan Ake. So Fabrizio Romano tweeted first that Chelsea had reached full agreement with the defender over personal terms, and then Matt Law confirmed and backed this up, also mentioning that the deal is very close to being fully agreed for Raheem Sterling as well. And then we got the news and the report from Matt Law in the Telegraph about this situation too, which also interestingly name dropped the likes of Jules Koundé, Kimpembe, Koulibaly, Matthias Ligt once again, and Tuchel wants 3 defenders this summer. Is that linked to the news potentially that says Azpilicueta is absolutely going to move on to Barcelona this summer? It's a bit interesting because from months now we've heard that Tuchel wants 2. Now it's gone up to 3. Some justification to this is maybe looking at a wing-back type player who could be classed as a defender, but that's quite interesting in itself. And again, what does that mean for the likes of Levi Colwill, who I think a lot of us hope is at least given an opportunity in pre-season to impress? But Nathan Ake, it looks like a deal could be done for around 40 to 45 million, which is a little bit lower than say 50 million, but I mean not too much. And my opinions on the deal haven't changed that drastically. I think Ake is a fine signing. Nothing more really. I'm not that excited about it. And it's not just a case of sign big player, sign flashy player, because as I said earlier in the week about Cristiano Ronaldo, those have bad implications, but this still could have bad implications because what is the ceiling for Nathan Ake at Chelsea? That's kind of my big question, especially if you're going to commit this amount of money. I mean, wages, I assume it's not going to be as high, obviously, as Raheem Sterling, so that may help Chelsea in the long term. But they aren't going to be low considering he's coming from Man City as well. And I just wonder, compared to other defensive targets who could give us more longevity, I think physically and sort of the profile of Ake compared to someone like Gleeson Bremer, who I've consistently brought up his name, and I saw a tweet again today because apparently Inter have an agreement with Bremer on personal terms, and Torino have asked for about 40 million euros, yet we are considering Ake for 40 million plus. We should be all over this. I agree. I think Gleeson Bremer is a really good alternative because just looking at sort of his profile on the left side of the fence, he very much fits the more aggressive, proactive defender, when Ake doesn't really represent that, and there are concerns over his physicality, but I don't have concerns about his professionalism or his ability to play at a decent level. I think he's proven, not only for club, but for country as well, for the Netherlands, that I think he's a decent defender, but I don't think with the price, I think with what you'd want him to be in a couple years' time, in 18 months' time, are we going to look back at this deal and think, wow, that was a great piece of business? Or are we just going to look at it and go, he was an all right player? I think that's a big question. And listen, we've had a lot of bad signings in recent years, and I said this earlier this week about like sort of redressing the balance in terms of wins and losses over transfers. But I look at Ake and I think, why spend 40 to 50 million on him when you've got Levi Colwill there, who I keep on mentioning? But, you know, if we signed 2 other defenders who have been mentioned, but you give a lot of those minutes that you would have to Ake, I think it makes a lot more sense in the long term. I think financially, you're potentially saving a lot more money by promoting Levi Colwill in the long term. But listen, Ake has had an interesting story as a player. You know, he probably could have made it at Chelsea. didn't get the opportunity. Had some good performances under Antonio Conte. I remember the Spurs semi-final in the FA Cup. He played really well in the back three, but then was sold off to Bournemouth. And then impressed. There was even concept that he could come back to Chelsea. I think when Frank was here, the buyback was coming up to expiry. Chelsea didn't go in for it. He signed for Man City. Interesting point, because another player that could be returning for pre-season is Ethan Ampadu, and I find it quite a staggering stat that over the last 2 seasons, Ethan Ampadu has more Premier League appearances than Nathan Ake. That speaks to Man City's great depth, and it's interesting hearing some Man City fans a little bit disappointed that they're not only losing Raheem Sterling but also Nathan Ake. But when you look at the starts that Nathan Ake has had, is he that important of a player for City to lose? I think it just kind of speaks to their great depth and what Chelsea are going to get. And Chelsea is struggling to sell players we don't play. I am on the more negative side about this in the long term, but I do think that Ake will be a competent player, hopefully a more versatile player that Tuchel maybe wants to use in different ways. So again, Tuchel making so many of these decisions. He has great influence this summer. And with great power comes great responsibility. I think there's going to be rightly a lot of scrutiny on Thomas Tuchel this season, because I don't think you can play the card as an excuse that this wasn't his signing. I think a lot of these signings, nearly all of them, are going to be defined by him. And it's not only the players he's bringing in, it's the players he's selling as well. So we'll see how that develops if Ake, like Sterling, gets announced in the coming days. Let's speak about Armando Broja, because The Athletic, there was an article about sort of his future and these kind of big talks he's going to have with Todd Boehly. And Nazar Kinsella reported about this earlier in the week as well. It's interesting with Broja, because I have kind of been resigned to feeling like he's going to be one of the young sales this summer, one of those young players who moves on permanently. Just the vibe we were getting maybe back in January, and the sense that Chelsea and the amount of interest from the likes of Napoli to West Ham to I think Newcastle have been linked. Southampton have obviously from their time with him last season and how well he did, and maybe the sense that the stock is quite high at the moment and Chelsea can get a decent fee for him. But as a general rule, I don't see the harm in Chelsea, and it seems there's been so many reports about Tuchel wanting to see this player in pre-season, wanting to see that player in pre-season, and I'll link Ian Matson here as well, because my colleague Adam Newson reported this evening that Ian Matson has been left out of the squad that's travelling to the US over the weekend, which is interesting because we heard earlier in the week, despite all reports that Feyenoord wanted him either on loan or a permanent deal, had sort of that deal had gone cold because Tuchel wanted to see him in pre-season, but only a couple of days later he's out of that and there is Premier League interest for him. Again, would that be a permanent deal? Would that be a loan? A loan is obviously not the worst thing for the long term. We could potentially bring him back, but again, could that be a player Tuchel looked at a little bit more closely in pre-season to try and see if he could add value to the squad in a key position, especially sort of covering for Ben Chilwell over a long season. And it looks like maybe we're not going to see that. But with Broja as a potential backup to Kai Havertz, I think I'll get comments being like, you can't play all these players, you can't keep them all. I think it's just a bit of a myth that these players are going in there and just demanding minutes instantly. I think like so many of the Cobham youngsters we've seen break through in recent years, it's all about getting that opportunity. The opportunity that Mason got, Tammy got, Fikayo Reece, all these players that got those opportunities in Trevor Chalobah last summer, which is such a great example of getting that opportunity, proving yourself, and then becoming a regular member of the first team that also saves the club a lot of money. I think given how much is happening in the market at the moment and how many deals could go wrong for Chelsea and how much work needs to be done in key positions, particularly at wing back, as I've mentioned before, and maybe at centre back as well, if you can save about 100 million on like 3 or 4 positions, cover positions mainly, that could be big for Chelsea in the coming years. Because Mark Gurhey 12 months ago, many people would have said, 20 million is a good deal. He's never stepped foot in the Premier League before. 12 months later, 20 million looks pretty cheap for Crystal Palace, and I think when they eventually sell him, they're going to sell him for a lot more. And I think it may be the same for the likes of Colwell. I think he's one of the big ones. I think Conor Gallagher is another big one, but I have confidence that Tuchel will use Conor Gallagher because of the way he speaks about him. We're not quite sure on the others, so I'd like to see how this develops. Finally, Frenkie De Jong. So Todd Boehly had that meeting, probably had some nice tapas in Barcelona last night. Apparently it wasn't just about potential players we could be signing, it was also about players we could be selling. Cesar Azpilicueta and Marcos Alonso apparently mentioned in the meeting, because apparently both have agreements with Barca, and it's about Chelsea getting the fee they want. On the Marcos Alonso side, I said this a few weeks ago, I'm not that fussed about a fee. I think it's the right time for him to move on. I think it's the right time for Azpilicueta to move on. Chelsea being encouraged, as it's reported today in the Evening Standard, that Chelsea should bid for De Jong. I think it's a bit far-fetched for me, because it's just a bit bizarre, Chelsea's transfer strategy. There are parts of it that make you a little bit confused over where we're going. De Jong would be another one. I'm not saying De Jong's a bad player. I'm just in the profile of midfielder he is. I'm not quite sure why we'd spend that much on him as a profile as opposed to someone else, when we've got the likes of Conor Gallagher coming back, when you've got Mateo Kovacic, when you've got Mason Mount, obviously, who could maybe fill a little bit more of a deeper midfield role this season. It doesn't make that much logical sense to me. The only way I could frame it in my head is that maybe because we know we can't get a certain midfield target this summer, we'll go for another midfield target. But we know that Chelsea have been trying to do a lot of deals, and I said this yesterday, trying to go around with a lot of deals, trying to hijack Richarlison, trying to go in for several players, having a lot of talks with defenders at the moment. So we'll see how this one develops. I'd like to know your opinions on De Jong, because it's been so kind of obvious Man United's interest, and it felt sort of inevitable that they're going to sign him, but it's kind of gone cold over the past week, and maybe Chelsea feel with Champions League football, if Tuchel wants to play her again, Tuchel will have influence over this as well. If Chelsea are going for a player, it's very likely, and it's very much set that Tuchel wants that player. Tuchel is interested in that player. So we'll see on that front. But that is it for today's news video. We're waiting for Raheem Sterling, I think, in terms of that big announcement. It's a little bit frustrating to kind of hear that Chelsea, I know logically you're dealing with the same club, but I think Raheem, I think it's big to have Raheem as his own kind of announcement, I think, because it's such a big signing. It seems like there's final details on Raheem Sterling to Chelsea, basically, and hopefully tomorrow or Sunday we will get the official announcement, and I will be on this YouTube video giving my thoughts on it. And I do have another video, and maybe a couple others as well, discussions over Raheem Sterling, because I think it is a big deal. But thank you guys for watching as ever. Follow me on Twitter at SonOfChelsea. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again very soon. All the best.